If you have ever heard the phrase property is theft before, and I'm willing to bet you have, you are already familiar with some of the work of the theorists that we're discussing today. And that means we are discussing the OG, the pugilistic, the provocative, the often contradictory Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. And that is, unfortunately, the best French accent you're going to get out of me today. I am so sorry, but welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back to the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series. This is where I go into the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers and break down their lives and their thought in a hopefully easy to understand kind of video format for anybody who's interested. Now, if you are seeing this, it may be on YouTube. That's because this is a free episode. And if you're interested in the full series, I really encourage you to go to the Patreon feed. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism and consider subscribing to the full 100. However, I'm not interested in gatekeeping any of this information. So if you are interested in a particular thinker and you don't really want to pay the subscription fee for any reason, I will send you that episode. Just drop me a line. No questions asked. However, if you are a subscriber, thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. It helps keep this whole project afloat. It helps keep the main feed reading series absolutely free for anybody. We're about to embark on David Graeber's incredible Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So we're going to get into that on the main feed, and your subscription really helps keep all of this running. So thank you so much. It is so deeply appreciated. Now, this video from Proudhon takes us into the next set of 10. We've already covered the first 10 proto-anarchist thinkers, and we're going to shift into what I'm roughly calling the classical anarchists. These are anarchists that are going to kind of lay a foundation for where else we're going to go in this series. And so there are a few contemporaries of Proudhon, people like Mikhail Bakunin, arguably a disciple of Proudhon. There are also people like Elisée Reclus. We've also got William Godwin, of course. And then we've got some more turn-of-the-century figures, people like Kropotkin, Malatesta, De Cleyre, who I've sort of swapped De Cleyre from the 20th century anarchists, our section coming up, into the classical anarchists, just because Emma Goldman fits a little bit better with that next set that we're going to talk about next. So that's just for my own convenience, and these designations are kind of nonsense anyway, but that looks a little weird, I understand. We're also going to cover some foundational kind of revolutionary figures, including Nestor Makhno in Ukraine. It includes as well an assassin, Liu Shifu, and hopefully all of this is going to set us up for what's to come. But to start any of this, we have to talk about Proudhon. Proudhon is, as far as we know, the first self-declared anarchist. And what he's doing here, what he's laying down in his thought, is going to reverberate over the centuries in anarchist movements. And it's actually going to, in a very real way, lead to a massive schism in the leftist movement that divides the First International. We'll get into a little more of that when we talk about Mikhail Bakunin, but for now, we need to understand where all of this is coming from. Let me give you a little bit of a roadmap here for where we're going in this video. The video is going to start with a little bit of larger context, how to think about Proudhon's work in the larger context of anarchist thinking. Then we're going to do a quick biography for Proudhon, because he was very much shaped by his circumstances, and we have to sort of understand how the conditions in this revolutionary France translated into the work that he was writing. And of course, he eventually ran for National Assembly, and that is quite significant. So we're going to get to that. We're going to also go through, in the ideas section, order, property, mutualism, and labor in that order. So tackle some of Proudhon's main ideas and see how they translate into modern anarchist thought. And then we are going to end on a reflection of his legacy. How do we think about Proudhon now? Hi folks, just real quick, it is me from the future. I try to keep these videos under the 30-minute mark for my own sanity, and because they are supposed to be kind of bite-sized, manageable, and accessible to anybody who wants to get into it. I don't want to confront anybody with giant videos, but I sat down for the edit today and realized that I have almost an hour and a half of recorded material. So for that reason, I'm going to be splitting this video into two sections, life and ideas. This is Proudhon. It makes sense that that script would have become so gigantic, and I don't want to cut anything out because I think a lot of it is important, but that's just a quick explanation for why this is in a bit of a weird format today. So they will both be out, they will both be free, they will both be available on YouTube. As always, check out the Patreon, but it's all free for this one anyway. Thank you so much for watching, and back to the video with no further ado. Thank you. And let's jump right in. Let's talk about the larger context. I felt the need to put this section in here because I think a lot of people, when they approach Proudhon, they are looking for, from the original anarchist thinkers, something that looks a lot more like modern anarchism. That is not what you will find here. You will find the underpinnings of what's going to come, but you will also find a lot of vague, often contradictory statements, often waffling, and a lot of change over the period of his thinking, which is natural for any great thinker. And the thing about Proudhon that makes him quite interesting, and at some points unique, is that he kind of reveled in these contradictions. He was there to throw a few bombs, and that is why you will get statements like property is theft, God is evil, anarchy is order. He loved to embrace this kind of contradictory motif and tease it apart. So as you read through Proudhon, you will get some incredible sweeping statements that read as true even though they are set up as contradictions. And you will also find, as you look a little deeper into Proudhon, that there's a significant amount of nuance with these sweeping statements. He'll lay down something like property is theft, his most famous maxim that still exists today. You see it in protest movements all the time. He'll lay something like that down, and then as you start to read through, you'll start to understand that actually he doesn't really mean that property is theft. He just means that some types of accumulation, excessive accumulation of property is theft. And so he will go on and try to eliminate things like interest and rent and stuff like that. But property in terms of communal ownership is not something that he's actually interested in. That may sound a little odd from the father of modern anarchism, but it is nonetheless what he believed. You will also find it a little bit odd that somebody like Proudhon, the father of modern anarchism, ran for a seat in the National Assembly. We will get to that later as we talk through his biography, because it was very much dependent on the circumstances of France at the time, the reasons that he felt that he could actually enact change within the system. But that does feel like a huge contradiction. With Proudhon, I think it's a little helpful to think of him as a lot of verve and a lot of spectacle and a lot of bold pronouncements that later get taken up by his disciples and refined and adapted into what we now consider to be modern-day anarchist thinking. The other thing that you need to know about Proudhon before we embark on this journey is that he was very much unlike any of the other intellectual giants of his era. He had huge and illustrious contemporaries, and he is absolutely their intellectual equal in basically everything, all of these great men, but he doesn't have their pedigree. For example, Karl Marx came from wealth. Mikhail Bakunin, the disciple of Proudhon, came from extraordinary wealth. Peter Kropotkin, who came later and is very much a disciple himself of these early anarchists, literally was an attendant in the court of the Tsar and hailed from this aristocratic base. Proudhon was nothing like any of those guys. Proudhon grew up poor. He had no formal childhood education. His father was a brewer. He grew up helping to tend cattle up in the mountains. So he is absolutely in the same rooms as these great illustrious giants of leftism, but he's not cut from their cloth. And make of that what you will. But let's get into his biography now. Let's talk about his life and where he comes from, and we'll get a little bit more into that idea of him not really ever fitting comfortably in these spaces. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon is born in 1809 in the town of Besançon near the Swiss border. He grows up in actually quite a rural area. He ends up working a lot in the mountains, and many historians later point to this as an influence on his thinking later in life. So Proudhon, for example, has a very great appreciation for nature and also the idea of dignified poverty, and he also has a real belief in work ethic, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later as well, but he's really into this idea. And so a lot of people who look at Proudhon and his work look at this early early childhood and the work that he had to put in these kinds of spaces and say, yeah, of course, this was tremendously influential for what came after. Now, despite Proudhon's lack of formal schooling, he was kind of a brilliant kid. He ends up winning a scholarship to a local college when he's a teenager. He is forced to leave that school probably because of money issues, but he finds himself an apprenticeship nearby. And that apprenticeship, and this should surprise nobody, especially if you went through with us through the Proto-Anarchists, that apprenticeship was with a printing shop. It's always the printing shop. Now, the printing press is where he falls into the grip of radical literature, and he crucially comes across a group of socialists in the town, and among them is Charles Fourier. Fourier is a really interesting figure. He's considered the father of utopian socialism, but he is espousing a very particular type of utopian socialism. He was, in many ways, a magical thinker. He supported the rights of women. He was a huge supporter of the rights of women, in fact. He believed in the transformation of labor into something beautiful. He wanted society to be transformed into a beautiful and harmonious whole. He was also absolutely insane. He was wildly anti-Semitic. He wanted to organize societies into phalanxes based on individual passions. And he once remarked that because the totality of the earth would become harmonized or reharmonized with the harmonization of human social life, that it would change the literal makeup of the earth and perhaps the oceans would turn to lemonade. And listen, I'm not giving Fourier due credit. He is a fascinating thinker and really, really influential, but he was bananas, often in a really satisfying way. But for what it's worth, Proudhon also found Fourier to be a little too wildly utopian for his taste. He also did not like Fourier's idea of free love, which was a big deal for Fourier. So this is an early influence for Proudhon, but it's not necessarily formative. We can see it as an influence, but he's not carrying Fourier's ideas forward in any real or meaningful way. Anyway, these are just some of the major influences that Proudhon is taking in and taking on board as he's using the printing press to complete his formal education. And it's in 1840. After he travels through France and he comes back home, he takes a position at a small printing press as a partner. He writes what is considered to be probably his most famous and most influential work, a work that becomes a calling card for young Proudhon. What is Property? The full title is What is Property? An Inquiry into the Principle of Right and of Government. And What is Property is a really fascinating document that absolutely puts Proudhon on the map. I have included a selection from there on the Patreon as kind of the reading for this week, but it is, if you get a chance to read it, it is so clear, it is so evocative, and it is so powerful. I'm going to read to you just the opening paragraph here, where he equates the formulation slavery is murder with his own formulation property is theft. He says, if I were asked to answer the following question, what is slavery? And I should answer in one word, it is murder. My meaning would be understood at once. No extended argument would be required to show that the power to take from a man his thought, his will, his personality is a power of life and death, and to enslave man is to kill him. Why then, to this other question, what is property, may I not likewise answer, it is theft, without the certainty of being misunderstood, the second proposition being no other than a transformation of the first. What is Property was a powerful document, and it does end up getting him on the watch list of the French government at the time. Now, they don't do anything drastic to him. It's considered a little bit too academic to really pursue, but he follows it up with a few pieces that do get him into more hot water and under increasing scrutiny when he publishes The Warning to Proprietors just 2 years later. He follows that up with On the Creation of Order, and right after that, in 1844, he heads to Paris. And if you followed me on this channel before, you know what happens in Paris. We saw the same thing with Frantz Fanon as he starts to drift into these leading lights in Paris. The young radical becomes further radicalized and starts taking on new connections. Perhaps we should all go to Paris. I don't know. But either way, in Paris, Proudhon meets up with some of the leading lights of the nascent movement, the nascent leftist movement, including a young Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin. And both Marx and Bakunin are really interested and excited to meet this up-and-coming French writer, the writer of What is Property? Marx, in fact, is initially on very friendly terms with Proudhon, and he would later celebrate him not just for supporting proletarians, but for being a proletarian himself. Remember, Proudhon is not like them. Proudhon does not come from money. He doesn't have formal education. He is a mountain cattle herder, and this is something that Marx deeply respects for a little while, because those relations quickly sour, but they started off in very good terms. 2 years later, though, by 1846, Marx is already on the attack against Proudhon. Proudhon had in fact declined to collaborate with Marx, citing Marx's intolerance for other perspectives and Marx's general kind of authoritarian trend. Marx, meanwhile, hits back at Proudhon for being nothing more than a petit bourgeoisie socialist. And this, by the way, is going to prime this leftist movement for what is going to become the huge split during the First International. This classic divide that still exists today between the communists and the anarchists. We will talk much more about what actually happens during this split when we talk about Mikhail Bakunin in a video coming up. But for now, just know that this early attack on Proudhon is very much taken up by his disciples, especially Mikhail Bakunin. And, of course, even later by Peter Kropotkin, and it is one of the reasons that a lot of these early anarchist thinkers are very preoccupied with trying to distance themselves from general Marxian thinking. They're trying to add things and elements to their thinking that will create distance and change the formulations of Marx into something much more anarchistic, because they feel the need to kind of support this schism. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the idea of labor right at the end of this video, but for now, let's leave that where it is, and we'll pick it back up with labor in this section and also with Bakunin's video later on. But let's come back to the life of Bakunin now, because he and France are about to enter a very tumultuous time. In 1848, Louis-Philippe, the French king, is overthrown, and France enters the Second Republic. Now, just a quick French history lesson here. Napoleon Bonaparte is defeated. 1815, France returns to the monarchy. This is the Bourbon Restoration. In 1830, you have something called the July Revolution, which briefly kind of shakes the power balance, but the monarchy is again restored. This time, though, the power shifts to a lower house, from the House of Bourbon to the House of Orléans. And this is what's known as the July Monarchy. And so much of Proudhon's early work is done during this July Monarchy. Then in 1848, you have the February Revolution, which ends up toppling Louis-Philippe and installing the Second Republic. And then the Second Republic makes a huge error because they end up electing the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Napoleon, to the presidency of the new republic. And then, of course, 3 years later, to absolutely nobody's surprise, Napoleon's nephew overthrows the Republic and it declares himself Emperor Napoleon III. And this is what inaugurates the Second French Empire. All of this happens in a very short and extremely tumultuous period of time. So France, at the time that Proudhon is working, is in a constant state of flux. That is pretty interesting when we think about the sorts of things that Proudhon is bringing to the table in terms of his ideas. But before the Second French Empire, Proudhon goes back to Paris. This is in 1848, after that February Revolution, because political change is in the air. At first, he's there to found a newspaper. He actually ends up founding several different newspapers, but then he looks at the National Assembly and he decides that he can do a lot more from within the system. So he runs successfully for a seat in the National Assembly. Unfortunately, in the National Assembly, he's actually very unsuccessful. He proposes a moratorium on debts and rents, which goes down like a lead balloon. The Assembly actually votes against the motion, 691 to 2. And he writes at the time, "I ceased to be in touch with the masses because I was absorbed by my legislative work. I entirely lost sight of the current of events." So even he is feeling like the National Assembly is drawing him away from his true calling, which which is a man and writer and advocate of the people. And that is expressed in his thought at the time. The last major thing that Proudhon does in the National Assembly is to found a people's bank on a set of really interesting principles. So interest-free loans, commodities that are exchanged for cash and valued on the basis of labor costs. But despite a very large initial subscription of people, the People's Bank ends up collapsing. Now, Proudhon from here enters a period of decline that starts with his arrest. He speaks out in very vehement terms against the president, again, the nephew of Napoleon, and against an anti-unemployment policy that he thinks is completely insufficient for actually solving any unemployment problems. And he's actually arrested in the National Assembly itself. And for the next 3 years, he is jailed. Now, it must be said, relative to some of the other anarchists that we will cover, his time in jail is extremely comfortable. He is let out of prison for extended periods of time. During those periods of time, he even ends up getting married. He fathers his first child, and he writes Confessions of a Revolutionary, his essentially prison journals. And he starts to build towards a mature vision of an anarchist society. It's in this work that you get his idea of a loose federation of autonomous communities, no national states, free federation. It's anti-hierarchical, it's anti-dictatorship, including, it must be said, a revolutionary dictatorship. So it makes the argument that people naturally gravitate towards fairness and order through freedom. In other words, in this period and in this work, Proudhon is giving us the shape of modern anarchism. And that takes us up into empire. So when the Second Republic collapses and France returns to empire, Proudhon goes into exile and he moves to Brussels. He continues to write. He's developing his ideas, especially on the sort of federalist structure, and he publishes what is generally considered his big kind of magnum opus. It's called Justice in the Revolution and in the Church. He moves back to Paris, very boldly, it must be said, in 1862. Emperor Napoleon III was still on the throne, but Proudhon wasn't much of a danger for the emperor anymore. He did continue to write, although he would occasionally kind of tread lightly around some of the more sensitive topics, just to keep himself out of trouble. And then literally on his deathbed, he completes his last work that's on the political capacity of the working classes. And in that work, he argues, and this is something that we will return to, not just in this video, but throughout this series, he argues that a true and authentic revolution cannot come from sort of some bourgeoisie class, no matter how enlightened they are, that it must originate with the workers themselves for it to be an authentic and successful revolution. We will return to this idea, and of course, it is an idea with a ton of modern resonance. But that's it. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon dies in 1865, and his legacy continues, obviously, into the modern day. Hi, it is future me yet again. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is going to be the end of part 1. Part 2 is going to pick up right where this left off as we talk about Proudhon's ideas, so we're going to get into that next time. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, tell me what you thought, tell your friends, all of that good stuff. We'll be back 2 weeks from now to cover the second part of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, talking about the foundations of modern anarchism and what he means really when he talks about property is theft. All of that great stuff still to come. So thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time. And sorry for the weird formatting once more. But anyway, see you next time. Goodbye.